Few lives in history have unravelled with such drama, disgrace, and contradiction. Most men who fall from power do so once. Rarely do they get a second chance, and even more rarely do they lose it all again. But one man did. A man who sailed under Captain Cook, who braved some of the most dangerous seas on Earth, who once survived being cast adrift in the middle of the Pacific by his own crew. Years later, he would rise again, this time not at sea, but as governor of a far-off colony, and once again the people under his command would turn against him. He was called a hero by some, a villain by others, but no one ever called his life ordinary. This is the story of the cursed life of William Bligh. In the late 1700s, the British Empire ruled the seas. Its navy was the largest in the world. Its ships reached every corner of the globe, and wherever British sails appeared, power followed. But this power came at a cost. Life aboard those ships was hard. The sea was dangerous. The discipline was brutal, and the rules were absolute. This was the world that William Bligh grew up in. William was born in England in 1754, and by the time he was just 7 years old, he was already signed into the Royal Navy. This might sound shocking today, but at the time it was common for boys to be entered into the naval rolls early, often so they could begin to build up years of service on paper. It was a career path filled with hardship, but for some, it led to greatness. William was one of those men who rose quickly. By the age of 16, he was serving as an able seaman. A few years later, he became a midshipman. But his real breakthrough came in 1776, when he was chosen to join one of the most important voyages in British exploration, the third and final expedition of Captain James Cook. Captain Cook was already famous. He had charted unknown waters, explored new islands, and helped expand Britain's knowledge of the world. Now, on his last journey across the Pacific, he brought young William Bligh aboard as his sailing master, the officer in charge of navigating the ship. It was a role that required not just intelligence, but precision, focus, and calm under pressure. William proved himself in all of these areas. He learned from Cook, watched how great expeditions were run, and became an expert in reading the stars, measuring distances, and keeping a ship on course across thousands of miles of open ocean. But he also learned something else, something that would follow him for the rest of his life. He saw how authority worked at sea. Orders were to be followed, not questioned. A captain had absolute power, and any threat to that power had to be crushed. Mutiny, when a crew rose up and overthrew its officers, was not just a betrayal, it was one of the worst crimes possible on a ship. It meant chaos, and it was punished by death. William's skills as a navigator were exceptional, but his temperament was sharp. He demanded discipline. He expected obedience, and had little patience for what he saw as weakness or disloyalty. This would earn him respect from some, but hatred from others. After Captain Cook was killed in Hawaii during that same voyage, William helped steer the crew safely home. He had proven his ability under extreme pressure, but what he couldn't know then was that his own life would one day echo Cook's, not in the way he lived, but in the way he was remembered. Years later, in 1787, William was chosen to lead a new mission. The British government, supported by wealthy plantation owners in the Caribbean, wanted to introduce a new food source for the enslaved population on the Sugar Islands. The plan was simple in theory, though difficult in practice. Collect breadfruit trees from the island of Tahiti, transport them across the Pacific and Atlantic Oceans, and plant them in the West Indies as cheap, abundant food. To command the voyage, the Admiralty turned to William, now an experienced navigator, but still only a lieutenant. The ship assigned to him was small, just 90 feet long. A former merchant vessel, she was renamed HMS Bounty, armed with a few cannons and partially converted into a floating greenhouse. But the ship was not rated, which had meant it had no Marines aboard to maintain order. William was the only commissioned officer on board. The rest of the crew consisted of young sailors, several midshipmen, and a few officers acting in temporary roles. Among them was Fletcher Christian, a man who had once been William's student in the Merchant Navy and was now his friend, or so it seemed. The voyage began in December 1787. Almost immediately problems appeared. The Bounty was too small for comfort. A third of it was filled with pots and tools for breadfruit. The great cabin, normally reserved for the captain, had been turned into a greenhouse. The crew lived shoulder to shoulder in tight, humid quarters, and there was little space to move, let alone relax. To reach Tahiti, William first attempted to sail west, around the southern tip of South America, a narrow and stormy passage called Cape Horn. The attempt failed. High winds and massive waves battered the ship for weeks. Men grew sick, supplies were wasted, and morale dropped. William eventually turned around and took the longer route east, along the southern tip of Africa. It delayed the mission by months. By the time the Bounty finally reached Tahiti in 1788, the crew were exhausted. They'd been at sea for over 10 months, but what they found in Tahiti was paradise. The island was warm, lush, and peaceful. The local people were generous. The climate was gentle. For the British sailors, it was a dream compared to the harsh life they knew. And over the next 5 months, far longer than planned, that dream took hold. The breadfruit plants needed time to mature before they could be moved, so the crew stayed. Many of the men formed relationships with local women. Some got married. They lived in open huts, ate fresh fruit, and swam in calm blue waters. The rigid life of the Royal Navy faded, and a softer, freer way of living took its place. But William saw the danger. To him, the crew were getting lazy, distracted, and undisciplined. He believed the spirit of duty was slipping away, and so he pushed back. Hard. William returned to strict rules. He criticized his officers in front of the men. He used sharp language, often humiliating people in public. He punished small mistakes with harsh words, and on rare occasions with flogging. His temper was quick, his pride was strong, and little by little the respect his crew once held for him began to crack. Even his closest officer, Fletcher Christian, began to change. Once loyal, Christian now found himself torn between duty and desire. He had a Tahitian partner, he had friends among the crew, and he had grown tired of William's insults and controlling ways. When the Bounty finally left Tahiti in April 1789, it was not the same ship that had arrived. It was more crowded. It was filled with fragile plants, supplies, and tension. William's criticisms continued. He accused Christian of cowardice after a failed mission ashore. He shouted at men for small offences, and then one day he accused Christian of stealing coconuts from his private supply. It was the final spark. In the early morning of April 28, 1789, Fletcher Christian made his move. Before the sun had fully risen on the morning of April 28, 1789, he and a group of men moved quickly through the dim corridors of the Bounty. They had quietly taken weapons, cutlasses and muskets from the ship's storage the night before. These were not outsiders or strangers. These were men William had led across oceans. Now they were there to remove him. They burst into his cabin while he was still asleep. Christian pointed a bayonet at his chest. William shouted, demanding to know what was happening, but it was too late. His hands were tied. He was dragged onto the deck in nothing but his nightshirt. The crew watched silently as their captain was overpowered. No one rushed to his defence. William tried to reason with them. He reminded Christian of their past, of the trust they had once shared. According to William's own account, he said, "You have dandled my children on your knee." But Christian didn't waver. His face, William later wrote, looked tortured. "I am in hell," Christian reportedly said. "I am in hell." The Bounty now belonged to the mutineers. Some of the men supported Christian. Others just wanted to return to Tahiti. A few simply stayed silent, too afraid or confused to act. In the end, about half the crew sided with Christian. The rest stayed loyal to William, but they were outnumbered and unarmed. William and 18 of his loyal men were forced into a small launch just 23 feet long. It was designed for short trips near shore, not open ocean survival. The mutineers gave them 4 cutlasses, some food and water, a sextant and a compass. But they took the ship's maps, firearms and marine chronometer, the instrument needed for precise navigation. William had no weapons, no charts, and no hope of reinforcement. He was left adrift in the middle of the South Pacific Ocean, over 3,600 nautical miles from the nearest safe European settlement. It was a death sentence. And yet it became one of the greatest survival stories in the history of the sea. Imagine this for a moment. You're on a small, overloaded boat with barely enough room to sit. The ocean stretches in all directions. You have a few sacks of dry bread, a little water, and almost nothing else. Storms are coming. You don't have a map. You don't even have a weapon to defend yourself if someone tries to rob you. This is the situation William and his men faced. The only chance was to reach Timor, a Dutch-controlled island in what is now Indonesia. The distance was over 3,600 nautical miles across open water, past dangerous reefs, and through uncharted islands. William took command immediately. He divided the food and water carefully, rationing it down to the smallest portion. Each man received only 1 ounce of bread per day, barely enough to survive. Fresh water was even more limited. One mistake, and they'd all die of hunger or thirst. They first stopped at Tofua, an island not far from the Bounty's last position. They hoped to gather supplies, but almost immediately the local people turned hostile. The men were attacked with stones and spears. In the chaos, one of the loyal crew, Quartermaster John Norton, was killed. It was the only stop William dared to make. After that, they stayed at sea, travelling day and night, exposed to storms, sun, and freezing rain. Their clothes were soaked and torn. Salt water blistered their skin. Some began to lose hope. Men quarrelled. Nerves wore thin, but William held them together. He navigated by dead reckoning, watching the sun and stars, using only his memory and instinct. And somehow, it worked. Each night they prayed together. William insisted on it. He also kept them busy. He ordered them to row, to bail water, to clean the boat, anything to stop them from falling into despair. They passed the Great Barrier Reef near Australia. The seas there were shallow, filled with coral that could rip the boat to pieces. But William guided them through. They even found a small island, Restoration Island, where they rested and ate shellfish. But the worst wasn't over. From there they crossed into open ocean once again, dodging storms and waves taller than the boat. By the time they reached Timor on June 14, 1789, they'd been at sea for 47 days. They were half-starved, sick and exhausted, but they were alive. 17 out of the 18 men had survived. Only John Norton had died back on Tofua. What William had done was almost impossible. Without proper equipment, he had steered a tiny boat over thousands of miles across some of the most dangerous waters on Earth. It was a triumph of discipline, skill, and sheer human will. Later historians would call it one of the greatest feats of navigation in maritime history. But even that wasn't enough to earn him peace. From Timor, William and his remaining men made their way back to Batavia, modern-day Jakarta, where they waited for a ship back to England. But the journey was far from over. Several of the crew, already weak from starvation, died of tropical diseases before they could sail home. By the time William finally reached Britain in March 1790, news of the mutiny had already spread, and opinions were divided. To some he was a hero, a man who had survived against all odds, who had shown leadership in the darkest possible conditions. The Admiralty honourably acquitted him in a court-martial for the loss of the Bounty, clearing him of any blame. But others saw the story differently. Whispers began to circulate. Was William too harsh? Was his leadership part of the reason for the mutiny? Some blamed him for humiliating his officers, for using cruel language, for losing the respect of his crew. His former friend, Fletcher Christian, had become a kind of tragic figure, torn between duty and a dream of freedom. And William, by contrast, was painted by some as arrogant, petty, and difficult. He wasn't forgotten, but he wasn't celebrated the way that he had hoped. His survival voyage should have silenced all criticism. Instead, it opened new questions. How could a captain lead so well in crisis and yet inspire such hatred on his own ship? It was a question that would follow William Bligh for the rest of his life. Years passed, wars came and went, and then in 1805, the British government came calling again. This time they didn't need him to sail across the Pacific, they needed him to govern it. In March 1805, William Bligh was appointed Governor of New South Wales, a British penal colony on the far edges of the world in what is today Australia. At the time, New South Wales was still young. The first fleet of prisoners had arrived just 17 years earlier. It was a remote and rugged place, meant to be a prison at the edge of the empire. But by the time William arrived, it had become something else entirely. The colony had settlers, farms, and families, but it also had problems, and serious ones. William was sent there for a reason, to clean up corruption. British authorities had received reports that the colony was being run more like a private kingdom than a lawful outpost of the Crown. The settlers complained. Trade was unfair. Prices were out of control. The law meant little. The entire economy, it seemed, was being controlled by a handful of powerful men. Officially, New South Wales was governed by the appointed governor and his civil officers, but in reality, another group held power, the New South Wales Corps. This was a military force, British soldiers sent to guard the colony, maintain order, and protect against outside threats. But over time, they had taken on a different role. With few checks on their authority, the officers of the Corps had become landowners, businessmen, and self-declared aristocrats. They weren't just enforcing the rules, they were writing them. At the centre of this power was a man named John Macarthur, a former officer who had grown rich through land, sheep, and trade. Macarthur and his allies controlled the most valuable resource in the colony: rum. There wasn't enough official currency in New South Wales. Coins were rare and British money was hard to come by, so the colony adapted. Rum became currency. You could trade rum for food, for tools, for land, even for labour. Soldiers traded it, officers hoarded it, corruption followed, prices were manipulated, debts were called in with violence. The economy wasn't just lawless, it was controlled by those who had the most barrels. When William Bligh arrived in 1806, he stepped into a nest of vipers. At first, William tried to lead calmly. He was older now, in his 50s, and had weathered both storms and betrayal. But soon he saw the scale of the problem. The New South Wales Corps were acting like warlords, not soldiers. They ignored his orders, they mocked civil authority, and Macarthur, now a wealthy and stubborn settler, refused to follow even the most basic rules. So William responded the only way he knew how. He cracked down. He banned the use of rum as a payment. He tried to seize illegal shipments. He demanded that military officers respect civil law. He suspended corrupt officials, confronted landowners, and issued strict orders. But once again, he underestimated his enemies. The officers of the Corps were not loyal seamen. They didn't respect him like his old crew had, or fear him like some had aboard the Bounty. These were men with land, money, and local support. They had business partners, political ties, and influence, and slowly they began to push back. Letters were sent to London painting William as unstable and authoritarian. And yes, William had survived mutiny at sea, but he didn't expect to be overthrown again, this time by land. It all came to a head in January 1808. At the centre of the storm was Macarthur. By this time he was not just a businessman, he was a symbol of resistance to William's rule. He openly defied the governor's orders, refused to pay fines, and encouraged others to do the same. When Macarthur tried to punish him, Bligh saw this as a direct challenge, so in an attempt to reassert authority, he had Macarthur arrested. But Macarthur was ready. He sent messages to his allies in the New South Wales Corps, the military force that had long acted like the real rulers of the colony. The officers were furious that one of their own had been treated like a criminal. They claimed that Bligh was overreaching his powers and that he was acting like a dictator, not a governor. And so behind closed doors, a plan was formed. On January 26, 1808, exactly 20 years after the First Fleet had arrived in Australia, the soldiers of the New South Wales Corps made their move. They marched through the streets of Sydney, fully armed. At their head was Major George Johnston, a respected officer and close ally of Macarthur. Civilians watched from doorways. No one resisted, but everyone could feel what was happening. The soldiers reached Government House, where William lived and worked. The governor, who had once survived a mutiny on the high seas, now faced something even more shocking: a mutiny on land, in a colony that was supposed to represent the reach and order of the British Empire. William's orders meant nothing. His status as governor was ignored. He was arrested by his own soldiers. According to later reports, William refused to come quietly. Some versions even claim he tried to hide under a bed, though that detail may have been exaggerated by his enemies to mock him. The image of a once powerful naval officer crouching behind furniture while soldiers searched his house became a symbol of humiliation. No blood was spilled that day, but make no mistake, this was a military coup, the first and only one in Australian history. The governor was now a prisoner, and the colony was under the control of Johnson and Macarthur. In the weeks that followed, Johnston declared himself lieutenant governor, while Macarthur took charge of the civil affairs. The two men acted as if they were restoring order, but in reality they were seizing control of the entire colony. They reversed many of William's policies. They reopened the rum trade. They reappointed the officials William had dismissed. They sent messages to England trying to justify their actions by accusing William of tyranny. But William wasn't done. For more than a year, William Bligh waited. He wrote letters. He gathered evidence. He demanded that his arrest be overturned and that his authority be restored. But no help came. England was thousands of miles away and communications were slow. The British government didn't yet understand the seriousness of what had happened or how far the rebellion had gone. William requested to sail to Hobart in Tasmania, hoping to gather support there and possibly raise loyal forces. But even in Tasmania, the response was lukewarm. The local authorities were hesitant to get involved. William remained a man in limbo, governor by law, but powerless in reality. The months dragged on. His reputation, already damaged by the events on the Bounty 2 decades earlier, now suffered again. His enemies portrayed him as arrogant, erratic, even unstable. They spread the story of his arrest under the bed, painting him as a coward. To them, it was a secondary fall from power, only this time they were in charge of the ending. Back in London, the truth was finally beginning to surface. Reports from both sides began arriving. The British government realised that an illegal military takeover had occurred, and while William was far from a perfect governor, the rebellion itself could not be tolerated. The New South Wales Corps had crossed a line. A new governor was chosen, Lachlan Macquarie, a military officer known for discipline and leadership. He was sent with fresh troops, a clear mission, and full authority to restore British law in the country. William Bligh never truly returned to power. He was officially cleared of wrongdoing, even promoted, but he never again held a major command. The man who had once guided ships across the Pacific and governed one of Britain's most distant colonies spent the rest of his life in quiet, far from the seas and rebellions that had defined him. History has struggled to pin him down. To some, he was a cruel tyrant. To others, a brilliant navigator, crushed by systems beyond his control. One thing is certain, William Bligh was no saint, but perhaps he wasn't a villain either. So what do you think? Was William Bligh a misunderstood genius who tried to hold order in chaotic times? Or the author of his own downfall?